Good evening and welcome to ABN's Jihad Watch program. I am Robert Spencer and we have a very special guest today, Raymond Ibrahim, who is the author of the Al-Qaeda Reader. Raymond is of Coptic Christian descent from Egypt, born of Egyptian parents in Los Angeles, and his most notable book is the Al-Qaeda Reader, which was a remarkable exploration of translation, I should say, of documents that he had discovered while working in the Library of Congress, documents written in Arabic that had never been translated and that gave remarkable insight into what Al-Qaeda was all about, what their motives were, what their goals were, and how deeply rooted they are in Islamic tradition, in Islamic texts and teachings. Previous publications of Al-Qaeda's writings had focused purely on their political aims, giving a highly misleading view of Al-Qaeda as a political organization with certain political grievances that, if redressed, would pacify them. But Raymond Ibrahim's Al-Qaeda Reader changed all that and showed that they were fundamentally a religious organization, an Islamic organization dedicated to warfare against and the subjugation of the unbelievers in accord with Quranic directives. Today we'll be discussing with Raymond Egypt behind the headlines. What is going on there and why? Why the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis are in the ascendancy in Egypt, and what the future may hold for Egypt and for the Middle East in general. And also Raymond's unique experience as a Coptic Christian and somebody who has immense familial connections in Egypt and knows in depth what is going on there. Raymond also is working on a new book also as well. And Raymond, can you tell us a little bit about what that book is all about?
Sure. First, thanks for having me, Robert. I'm very happy to be joining you today. The book I'm writing right now, in fact, is about Muslim persecution of Christians, which is a topic I've sort of taken up lately, or for the last maybe couple of years, earnestly, because of the fact, as you well know, it's so little covered in the mainstream media. And it's also reaching epidemic proportions. So my book, I don't have a title yet, it's still tentative, but it's focusing purely on Muslim persecution of Christians. And I think one of its best features is a lot of people usually address these issues of Muslim persecution of Christians in one area or one region. For instance, the Copts of Egypt is of course a big, one of the bigger ones that people are at least a little aware of, but I've tried to take a more holistic approach to demonstrate a certain point, which is basically I'm covering it all from the Muslim world. So I'll do Nigeria, as you know, of course, the Boko Haram jihad on Christians, that's nonstop, where, you know, not a day really goes by without some crazy attack or destruction of a church or murders of Christians. And so I start, let's say, with Nigeria, but I also go as far east as Indonesia. And so the point is, I try to document the persecution of Christians in Nigeria, in Sudan, in Kenya, in Somalia, and these, of course, would be sub-Saharan African nations. But I also do the Arab world, from Morocco to, you know, the Eastern Arabian Peninsula. And then I also do Central Asia, which would be the stands, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, of course, Iran. And so the point that I hope the book will have is to just show you that you have all these different nations that I just pointed out, and they all speak different languages, they're different nationalities, they look different racially, ethnically, and yet you see the same exact pattern of persecution of Christians. And so I think it becomes undeniable that the one common denominator that Nigeria has, that Indonesia has, that Egypt has, that Turkey has, that Iran has, all countries that are completely different, is Islam. And I think, and I'm hoping that that will, you know, be eye-opening to kind of connect the dots of what's going on. It'll be, it should be coming out hopefully early next year by Regnery, and I'm in the final stages, or so I hope. And so yeah, hopefully it'll open some eyes.
Yeah, I hope so, Raymond. That's a much needed topic and one that's gotten very, very little coverage in the West. Right. And I would ask you, actually, why do you think that might be? Why do you think that Muslim persecution of Christians, as rampant as it is, I mean, look, you just named countries stretching halfway across the world. And in countries, you know, we're always hearing Islam is not a monolith. And indeed, countries with vastly differing cultures and vastly differing languages and ways of life, and yet they all have in common this persecution of the Christians. Why do you think that this just hardly registers at all in the Western media?
I think, in fact, I'm writing an article right now. I think this issue, and I'll try to elaborate it, of Christian persecution by Muslims in many ways is the Achilles heel of Islam's image. And I'll tell you why. It's okay for the mainstream media to report that Hamas or Hezbollah or Palestinians are attacking Israel and shooting rockets. And it's okay to report that Muslims in Europe are rioting and vandalizing and just calling death to every non-Muslim. Why is that okay? Because in the current paradigm in the mainstream media and basically the liberal mindset of academics and pundits and all these people that we see 24 hours on TV, all the talking heads, the current paradigm that they always are all news through is basically that these Muslims are underdogs, and therefore whatever violence they do, no matter how outlandish, no matter if they're screaming Allahu Akbar, which of course puts their actions in a purely Islamic framework, no matter any of that, it's easily bypassed. Why? Because they're the underdogs. So in Israel, well, Israel of course is more powerful than Muslims, so you have to expect them to react with great violence because they're so frustrated and they have no other option than to, for instance, engage in terrorism. Same thing in Europe or in the West in general. Muslims are, of course, outnumbered, they're the minorities, they're marginalized, et cetera, or so the mainstream narrative goes. Therefore, obviously, they're reacting out of aggression. But when you come to this issue of Christian persecution, you can no longer use this argument because now you have Muslims where they are dominant in the Islamic world, in their own lands, where they're the vast majority, and they're persecuting and killing people who have absolutely no political influence, who have no agenda, who simply want to go to church and pray, and they're killing them. So I think when you look at that, when you look at those three, Muslims attacking Israel, Muslims attacking Europe, and then Muslims attacking Christians, it's very hard for that latter one to be rationalized because now you can't say Muslims are outnumbered, Muslims are frustrated, Muslims have a political grievance. None of these excuses that work so well in the Israel or Western paradigm work when it comes down to these minorities. And of course it's any minority, but really I focus on the Christian phenomenon because that is the largest segment, in fact. Egypt alone, as you know, has at least 10 million Copts. According to the church, which has registries based on baptism, there's about 17 million Copts. And the reason, of course, is that the vast majority of what we call the Muslim world is really occupied territory that belong to indigenous Christians from Egypt, including the Arabian Peninsula. At least there, large segments of Jews and Christians were there, but of course Syria, as you know, and Turkey and Egypt, all the way westward, all these were really Christian nations. So you saw large pockets of Christians that are there and present. And then also because Christianity is an evangelizing component that other religions don't have, except Islam through dawah. So you have lots of converts in Islamic nations, Protestant converts, and this is usually the case in Iran and Central Asia and Eastern Asia. So it's so back to your question, which is an excellent question. Why does the mainstream media bypass it? I think it has to do with the fact that it can't be rationalized away. And ironically, they still try. So for instance, and you're aware of this, when they finally, mainstream media is forced to report on an especially egregious attack on Christians, the New Year's Eve church bombing in Alexandria that left over 20 people dead, or the Iraq church bombing, I think in late October 2010, that left maybe 70 dead. You have to report it, yet still always try to, in the end, a rationalization. I remember the Egyptian example where the churches were bombed in Alexandria. The headline will say the truth, which is basically Egyptian church bombed, etc. And then the first sentence states bare-bones facts. On this day, this church was bombed. And then the next three paragraphs are about rioting Christians, angry, retaliating. And so at the end of the day, when you're done with the report, it almost feels like sectarian strife, which is exactly how they want to portray it, as if you got two strength groups, Muslims and Christians, fighting, when it's far from that. It's persecution. Same thing with the Nigerian. They'll blow churches on Christmas, they'll blow them up in Easter, Boko Haram, that is, and then the media will mention it, and it will focus on the Christians became so intolerant, and maybe they attacked a Muslim, and that becomes the news. So that's why, to your question, I think it's easy to talk about Muslims attacking anyone and everyone because they're the oppressed and frustrated underdogs. In fact, as you pointed out earlier, that was the whole case with Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda hit America, 9/11, and of course other terrorist attacks after. Most of the experts talk heads rationalized it as political grievances, and that is exactly what you pointed out. I wanted to translate that to show the other side, which then squares the conflict West and everyone else, every non-Muslim who's an infidel, through religious terms. Basically, they'll say, we are fighting just because Sharia law commands us to subjugate you, for instance, via Quran 929, sword verses 9:5, and these verses. But of course, the media will talk about it. They just use the paradigm that is the Western mindset, which when it comes to this Christian issue, it's hard to get away with that. So I think that's the main reason that they don't really want to report too much on it.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's very true. That they have these templates, as it were, of ways in which to view the world and ways in which to view the news, and they fit the Muslim persecution of Christians into them. And so the Christians are not playing their proper role of being the oppressors and the Westerners and the racists and so on. And the Muslims are not playing their proper role of being the oppressed victims. And so it messes with their paradigm. They don't have any way to deal with it. And so when they ignore it for the most part, and then when they report on it at all, it's in the sense of the clashes. As you ably pointed out, there was a little bit of trouble with the sound, but I got the gist of what you were saying, and I hope the viewers do as well, that they act as if there's some sort of a mutual clash going on, as if when the Christians fight back in Nigeria, that they are just as much the aggressors as the Muslims who began the conflict, and so on. And very rarely do they portray it as it accurately is, as unprovoked attacks by Muslims motivated by the jihad ideology. But in any case, now let's turn to the topic of the day, which is Egypt and what's going on there. Now, of course, we all heard back in January 2011 that this was this wonderful outpouring of democracy and pluralism, that Egypt was now undergoing the glorious Arab Spring and was going to turn into a Western secular state and would be virtually indistinguishable from New Jersey within a year or two. And of course, none of that was true. None of that has turned out. And so can you tell us a little bit about what actually has been happening over the last couple of years in Egypt?
Sure. It's kind of a tragic story a little bit because, especially in Egypt, as you know, the earliest people who started the whole Tahrir Square and the Twitter or, social media network were not, whatever word you want to use, the bad guys. Yeah, most of them were Muslims, and a lot of them were some were Christians, but they had sort of a secular worldview, and they were trying to, and as you know, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis in the very earliest stages didn't even want to participate in these. And I even recall Salafi scholars coming out and supporting Mubarak through Islamic doctrine by correctly pointing out that in Sharia law, you do not depose the ruler or the sultan unless he prevents Islam or unless he is proven to be a kafir or an infidel. So it's kind of funny. It started off, those segments were there, and these are the same segments who are rioting right now ever since Mohammed Morsi made his, little power coup trying to dominate the constitutional draft. So they're there, but of course, for various reasons, Islamists or the radicals or the Islamic supremacists, those guys, you can say hijacked or whatever, they took it over, bottom line. And a lot of that, of course, as you know, was helped by the American administration, who was very obvious in their support of the Muslim Brotherhood, and which is not surprising considering that the White House and much of the government is infiltrated by Muslim Brotherhood types and CARE types and these people who have so basically, and I understand the mentality or the sort of strategy which was used, which is basically the Salafis are the bad guys, we're the moderates, you better go with us because the alternative is worse. Now, of course, they're both the same thing. In my mind, the Salafis and the Muslim Brotherhood share the same ideology. The only difference is the Salafis say publicly and unabashedly what the Muslim Brotherhood does not say, but does do.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us, why don't you tell us a little bit of background about who exactly the Salafis are, and then we'll move on to the Muslim Brotherhood, the same thing.
Sure. The Salafis they're kind of an interesting branch. Of course, the word Salafi just means in Arabic, it refers to the Salaf, or the, as they call it, the righteous forebearers, or the early generations that thrived with Muhammad. Usually they say it's the first 3 generations. Muhammad and the following two generations, which basically coincide with the golden age, or the righteous caliphs, the righteous caliphs, which is Abu Bakr, Omar, Ali, and Uthman. So this is the golden era. So basically, to the Salafis, they want to follow literally as close as possible those first three generations and Muslim and Muhammad's generation. That's why they look the way they do. So they grow the beard and they shave the mustache and they dress in very Islamic terms and they try to follow the Sharia to the letter. But what's interesting about them is these guys were, and they became very popular in Egypt, and that's where really the name kind of stuck with them, even though the name itself, the word is generic. People have been, Ibn Taymiyyah, 13th century, the hero of the Salafis, a scholar, Hanbali scholar and jurisprudent, he would talk about the Salaf. So the word is old and the concept is old, but being resurrected as an actual party is sort of new. And so in Egypt, you had the Muslim Brotherhood since the beginning of the 20th century, and that was really it. That was the main mother organization of the Islamic mentality, or the pro-Sharia type thing. And these guys, in the beginning, they espoused violence, they engaged in violence, then they learned and they became smart, where all it is now, they understood the pragmatic approach, which is violence is not going to work. We're going to work sort of through a grassroots movements, bottom up, and we're going to indoctrinate society. And that's basically what happened. And that's why they got such a large percentage of the vote. But the Salafis are essentially also funded by the Wahhabis. And see, all these terms get confusing, the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia. The Wahhabis, in short, the Wahhabis, the Salafis in Egypt, Al-Qaeda, all of these organizations are fundamentally Salafi. And Wahhab, of course, is just the name of the founder, 18th century Puritan, as they call him, who reformed Islam in Saudi Arabia and made it very literalist. And so that's the same thing with the Salafis in Egypt. That's the same thing with Al-Qaeda. That's the same thing with any of these guys who are screaming for Sharia and Caliphate. They have a Salafi mindset. So that's who these guys are, but they're sort of new. You hear from people that I talk to in Egypt, they're not as, in numbers, they're not that large. They're one of these, very vocal minorities. So they're not that big as far as numbers, certainly not as much as the Muslim Brotherhood, but they're very vocal, they're very influential, and they get a lot of that through Saudi backing, because like I said, the Wahhabis and the Salafis are the same ideology. So the funders are usually those rich Gulf states who are trying to disseminate their own ideology, the Wahhabi/Salafi ideology.
Now, it's important to emphasize, am I correct in saying that the Salafis do not oppose the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood? They don't oppose Muslim Brotherhood rule in Egypt, but rather support it. Is that correct?
Well, right. No, you are correct. And the more time goes by, the more we start understanding that from the beginning, the Egyptian, it was different groups. So we had, and people wanted to shy away from the sort of secular Islamic divide. And they said, no, there's different kind of nuances involved. But the more time passes by, the more they all coalesce into one idea. So even though Salafis have been critical of Mohammed Morsi and have been critical of the Muslim Brotherhood and vice versa, now that Mohammed Morsi has done what he's done with this grab for power and an attempt to kind of influence the constitution, immediately the line has become so clear. Now, secularists are all in one camp, and Muslim Brotherhood, Salafis, Sheikh Qaradawi, anyone who wants to see Sharia is now all with Mohammed Morsi. And so you can now start seeing that, despite all the semantics and the little arguments that they've had back and forth, when it comes down to it, they all want the same thing. And now, surprise, or no surprise at all, of course, now they're all with Morsi, who they were critical of as being too moderate.
Now, speaking of moderate, you said a minute ago that the Muslim Brotherhood started out violently, but then saw that it could get what it wanted without being violent.
Right.
Now, I remember a few years back, I was actually at a party in Washington, and I'm not sure, I think you might have been there as well, but in any case, I got into a discussion with Robert Leiken of the Nixon Center, which is an influential think tank in Washington, and he was telling me that it was very important for the United States government to engage moderates, to engage peaceful Muslims who wanted to work through the political process, and so on. And Leiken actually became one of the authors of a very influential policy paper that was adopted to a great degree in the State Department that recommended that the United States work with, cooperate with, accommodate, and try to aid the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt precisely because it was not violent. Now, Uh, what do you think about that kind of an enterprise in general? What is the goal of the Muslim Brotherhood, and how does it differ from the goal of Al Qaeda?
You know, to me, as you know, the slogan of the Muslim Brotherhood says it all. They use one word, "uddu," which comes straight from the Quran, and it means prepare. And it's from a Quranic verse that you know, I'm sure very well. Prepare, you know, steeds of war to terrorize your infidel opponent.
Chapter 8,
Okay,
verse 60.
right. So that is their word, prepare. Now, what does prepare mean? Prepare doesn't mean you go to war right now. Prepare doesn't mean you wage jihad. Prepare means you build up until you think how you can actually launch a jihad and win. That's what they've been doing. And if you look at their progress, that's exactly what they've been doing. I mean, think about this. These guys right now, Mohammed Morsi, and all these guys that are out and sitting in parliament, it was just a few years ago they were all in jail. These guys were all in prison for inciting against the government, not because the government is authoritarian and they want like liberal secularism or democracy, but because they want full-blown Sharia to be governing the state. And they were attacking churches, they were attacking government, they were killing people, and they were put in jail. And now look at how strategic and smart they were, because they've played this card by renouncing violence, at least in I think around the 60s and 70s they pretty much pushed it away, and that's why people like Ayman Zawahiri, the current leader of Al Qaeda, the Egyptian, he was once, of course, a Muslim Brotherhood member, but he broke away because he didn't like their pragmatism. Of course, in retrospect, their strategy is working more than his. So they've kind of followed this, and you see, and what amazes me though is this is not hidden. They don't hide this. This is so open. Like I said, their slogan is, the Constitution is our Quran, Muhammad is our example, Jihad is our way. Nothing about this is ambiguous. This is the kind of rhetoric or the slogan that Al Qaeda would stand behind. So they don't hide anything, but simply because they're not found or they don't engage in violence like the Salafi jihadist organizations, that has been enough for the West to say, okay, these must be the good guys, because it's okay for them to believe what they want, or try to get what they want, not doing violence, and that's the cutting line, and so they're good and we can deal with them. All along, of course, they have their agenda, and it just progresses, decade after decade, to now we have what would have been unthinkable years ago. I sometimes watch videos of, for Egyptian presidents like Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, and I saw a video that he was talking, I think in the mid 60s, and as you know, back then people were at least they looked secular. Everyone was wearing a suit. You didn't have any of these beards, and he's talking to a large assembly, and he's making fun of the Muslim Brotherhood because one Muslim Brotherhood, the Supreme Guide came and said he thinks women need to wear hijab. And so when Gamal Abdel Nasser quotes this, the entire assembly busts laughing, as if that's even possible, because then no woman really did. It was very, very few women that would look like that. And lo and behold, it's a few decades later, and the majority of the women are running around in the hijab. So they work incrementally, and now the great danger is, they from bottoms up, but now they're on, the Muslim Brotherhood are on top. And if we're able to do what they've done by dominating society from a bottoms up, you can imagine now what they can do top down.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And, incidentally, speaking about violence and nonviolence and how spurious a distinction this is, since the goal is always, in both cases, Islamic law and the rule of Sharia in the society, it's also important to note that Hamas, the jihad terror group in Gaza and the West Bank as well, has a presence has a connection to the Muslim Brotherhood. Can you expound on that?
Yeah, I mean, Hamas is it's a branch. It's the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, founded by this spiritual leader Sheikh Yassin, who of course was killed. So they're the same. They're the same mentality, same and they're also the same in the sense that, as I pointed out, they're very open. Their charter calls for the destruction of Israel, and all these things. But somehow or other, they're considered by some people as moderate and people that you can work with and deal with. And I think in the West, it's as you pointed out with that one paper, that foreign policy paper, it's become so indoctrinated, the idea that the dividing line of which kind of Muslim I can deal with is the non-violent. And so you get all these books and all these analysts and all these writers and experts who talk about non-violent Islamists are the way to go because they're not. But it's such a short-sighted view. This is the problem with it. It's almost like they're saying, we know they want all the intolerant aspects of Sharia law, but as long as they're not being violent and hurting people today, it's okay. We'll let them we'll work with them as they progress towards that goal, which is it just shows a very narrow kind of myopic view of reality. And that's happening with Hamas, it's happening with the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, it's amazing when you think of the US president. Because I'm a student of history, and I always compare, the past with the present. And to think that today, where we have a U.S. president who's friends with the Muslim Brotherhood, who invites outlawed organizations. I remember a while back, he actually, in a very hush-hush way, invited someone from Al-Jama al-Islamiyya, or the Islamic group, which is a terrorist organization. And I mean, if I compare this to just a few generations ago, no, what American president would even have anything to do with these people? And now we've gotten to this point. And so this, to me, kind of exposes a sort of, a malady in the way that the Western mentality is working. It's so temporal, so myopic. It's just looking at the moment. It's kind of thrown all history overboard because we're going to start anew. We're going to create a utopian society. All we have to do is be nice to people, and they'll come around. And it's going rapidly downhill, and it's just going to get worse and worse because, as you know, the Muslim Brotherhood is preparing. They're just preparing. They're getting stronger. And every generation or decade, they've gotten stronger to the point that now the Muslim Brotherhood, who's in jail, is now sitting in the throne of Egypt. So what more? I mean, give it a few more years, and where are we going to be at?
Well, what is the goal of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt? What do they want? What kind of a society do you think they envision 10 years down the road? And what's the connection, if any, between the Muslim Brotherhood takeover in Egypt and the similar changes of government in Tunisia and Libya and probably in Syria pretty soon? What does that bode for the U.S. and for the world in general over the next 5 or 10 years?
All of these people, this is why we come to another issue, which is this. It's somewhat helpful to use the proper terms for various groups, to call Salafis Salafis, and to call Muslim Brotherhood, and to call Al Qaeda, and to call Saudis Wahhabis, and to use these terms. It is legitimate to do that, to have a clearer understanding. But there's a disservice because it implies to people who are not as familiar with these issues as you and I, that these groups are just really different. They have their own agenda, and that is the furthest thing from the truth. Because all these groups, where do they get their agenda? Where do they get their ideology? From the same exact sources. They get it from the Quran. They get it from the Hadith, the prophetic words of Muhammad and his actions. And they get it from the verdicts and fatwas of the ulama, especially whenever there's consensus. I mean, and this is the irony to me. Islam, of all religions, Sunni Islam, particularly mainstream Islam, is so clear-cut. It's so black and white. It doesn't, it's not some mystical thing where we're not sure what they mean by it. It's very clear-cut. And so if you have a Sunni organization, whether it calls itself Muslim Brotherhood or Salafi or whatever, they want what Islamic law wants, what Sharia law wants, which is first and foremost at this point a caliphate, to unify the Islamic world the way it was before it was, broken apart by the West about 100 years ago. So they all have kind of different names and different styles, but they all have the same exact agenda. And for instance, when I read Ayman Zawahiri, as I mentioned him earlier, the current Al-Qaeda leader, the Egyptian who was formerly a Muslim Brotherhood, he wrote a long book. In English translated, would be called The Bitter Harvest, and it's a 200-page denunciation of Muslim Brotherhood. And nowhere does he attack them for doctrine. Nowhere does he attack them because they believe in some sort of moderate Sharia. The entire attack basically has to do with their strategy, which is that they're pragmatic, which is that they work slowly, which is that they denounced violence. Now, to me, that's eye-opening because there's no conflict in ideology between Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood. The conflict is solely how to bring about this vision. And so this is why all of these groups, if it's a Sunni and if they're talking about we want Sharia, they're really on board. The only difference is how they go about it. So the Salafi group like Al-Qaeda goes about it through jihad. Muslim Brotherhood goes about it through dawah and taqiyya, deception, in all this form. And all of these, of course, are legitimate through Islamic jurisprudence. So in a way, they all actually complement each other, and they all inadvertently work together toward the same goal. The only differences are really superficial. They have to do with their tactics and strategy.
Indeed, indeed. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be back with more on Egypt, on the Muslim Brotherhood, on the Islamic supremacist revolutions all around the Middle East, and much more with Raymond Ibrahim on ABN's Jihad Watch show. I'm Robert Spencer, and we'll be right back after this.
You are watching ABN.
Hi, this is David Wood from Jesus or Muhammad. As I'm sure you've heard, ABN has some significant financial needs. A lot of the equipment here is either outdated or damaged, and it's affecting the broadcast. I'll say ABN does a great job with what they have, but they could be doing much more if they had some newer equipment, some newer cameras. And so I encourage everyone to support the work that's going on here. We'd like to have more broadcasts, more shows, more programs, and we can only do that through financial donations. And so I encourage everyone out there to contribute whatever you can. And beyond all of this, apart from the technical needs, there's also the security needs given the increase in threats. And so if ABN is going to continue carrying on this work, they're going to need your support as they always have. And so as as we end out the year and you're thinking about where you'd like to donate, I don't think you'll find a better place than ABN.
We're back. This is ABN's Jihad Watch show. I'm Robert Spencer, and we're here today with counter-jihad superhero Raymond Ibrahim, who has been discussing the revolution in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood takeover, and the ultimate goals of the Islamic supremacists, the various groups there, Al-Qaeda, the Salafists, and the Muslim Brotherhood. And Raymond, turning now to the Coptic Christians in Egypt, you, of course, are a Coptic Christian of Egyptian descent, born in the United States, I believe, from Egyptian immigrant parents. And can you tell us a little bit about your own background and the situation of the Copts in Egypt today as the Muslim Brotherhood has taken over?
Sure, and thanks for asking me about that. I'll now give you a more personal or picture, less less the Islamic scholar or specialist, and more kind of my own family background. The one thing that always struck me as I grew up, for instance, as I grew up young, let's say in the 70s, and I would see images of the Iranian Revolution and Egyptians rioting, and of course at that point in the 70s, the Muslim Brotherhood and the beard started to become prominent, and kind of a more backward look. And so I would always look to my parents who came from Egypt and just basically. And in my mind, history progresses. And this is usual history. So things become, if you want, more liberal. And so when I would see these images as a young man, I would think to myself that surely in my parents' day, it was even worse. I mean, it must have been the Stone Age. And that would infuriate, especially my mother. And she would show me pictures, and I would be shocked because the Egypt that she would show me looked nothing like the Egypt of today. It looked like a little Europe, really. Pictures of her and just Egyptians in general. I didn't see a single picture of a woman with her head covered. Women were in dresses and heels. All the men were in suits or in pants and jeans. You never saw these images, and always that sort of surprised me because how does something go backwards? How does something go from this to that? Because we in the West are used to the opposite, which is things are more conservative, if you will, and then they become more liberal or more progressive. So that was always an interesting thing for me growing up. And that was, in fact, when I started to get very interested in this phenomenon. Why is this happening? And so until this point, when I talk to people that family in Egypt and my own parents, they would tell me in their day there was nothing like that. I mean, people who were looked like a Salafi, the very few ones, were considered the marginalized outcasts who just had the worst jobs. They worked as doormen, and very contemptible. Christians had it pretty good. No one, people almost wanted Muslims would befriend Christians. Now, of course, now we come to a tricky issue. What does one mean by Muslim? Because someone was going to say, well, they're not true Muslims. That may be, but that's really how they were, by and large. Most Muslims in that time, they were just very secularized, and I attribute that to the fact that, of course, Egypt and a lot of the Islamic world was colonized earlier by European powers, and because they were stronger, because as you know, Islam respects power, and this is its beginning. It's all about respecting power and going along with it for the glory. So I think when Islam was defeated by the colonial powers, and colonial powers came in, and back then, of course, Westerners were not apologetic about their ways. They were proud of it. And I think a lot of Muslims, the perfect example, Ataturk of Turkey. I mean, we're talking the last sultanate, the last really caliphate of the Islamic world in the 20th century, and the head of that country abolished it just to become secular, to look Western, to act like Western. They even, forfeited the Arabic script and started writing Turkey with the Roman alphabet. So you had a lot of, back in the early 20th century, Muslims, whatever their faith was, which I think was very, watered down, trying to be secular, and this is the Egypt that my parents grew up in. And then, it's gotten to the point now where, my mom would tell me she can't even recognize it. The very few times and she's not going anymore, of course, but the last time she went, she said, I felt like I was in Saudi Arabia. It's just like a Wahhabi look that is so alien to what she remembers. So it's kind of interesting to look at this big country, because also it's important to keep an eye on Egypt, because Egypt is sort of the paradigm for the rest of the Islamic world, especially the Arab world. It's kind of right in the heart. It's always been sort of the intellectual leader. It has Al-Azhar. It has a long history. And so really, when you look at the trends there, they're very indicative of the trends elsewhere in the Islamic world. And so where are we at now is what we're seeing, which is kind of a disavowal of this sort of secular thing. Not totally. These people who are, I just heard a video, it's amazing, of a woman on a talk show, Arabic talk show, and she called in and just, she's in tears, attacking Morsi for what he's doing and all the chaos. And she's saying, I wish God would have paralyzed my hand the day I went to vote for you. So, and she's in tears, saying, I wish I was out of this country. It's become a hellhole thanks to you. Why did we trust you? So, it's not so clear cut to say that everyone's on board with him. Sure, anyone who wants Sharia, as we've discussed earlier, whether they identify themselves as Salafis or Muslim Brotherhood, whatever, are all on his side now. But there is that component that is, and on a personal note, let me tell you something about Egyptians. Egyptians, and if you talk to any Egyptian, they'll tell you this. The character of the Egyptian is the most kind of, it's very lively. It's not Afghanistan, where kind of draconian Sharia and, morose life and austere lifestyle is easily enforced on an Egyptian, because Egyptians are considered the most kind of fun-loving, happy-go-lucky Hollywood. Egypt's called the Hollywood of the Arab world. And so it's interesting what's happening. Now, this is, of course, not to say that the other guys aren't there. After all, Egypt also gave us the Muslim Brotherhood, and it gave us Ayman Zawahiri, and it gave us Sayyid Qutb. So that's not to discount the fact that Egypt is also and has the potential to become a strong Sharia state. But you really have such divergent elements, and you have the Copts, who represent also a big segment. So what's going to happen is very interesting to see. Look at the riots right now that are happening. It's not like people are just rolling over and saying, okay, sure, go for it, Morsi. So it's interesting to see. But as for the Copts, their situation has really gotten bad because, as I was pointing out earlier, in my family's time, what happened is this: there was very little persecution, but there was lots of discrimination, and that was accepted. In fact, that's why my parents left, because even though they were educated, highly educated, they couldn't get a job just because of their names, because they're Christians. And so discrimination was always there, and it's still, of course, there, even worse. But wholesale attacks and persecutions and these things really started. I mean, they've always been there, but they really started picking up in the 70s, and that's when they were already gone. But since then, I have lots of family there, and they have all kinds of stories. Most of them revolve, of course, around discrimination and disparaging words and just being treated contemptuously just because they're Christian and they go to church. So the situation is getting really bad for them there. And I mean, look at the church attacks that are happening. And now when they talk about Sharia law, and I'd like to hear your opinion on this, actually, see what you think. But so they're always talking about, we want Sharia, we want Sharia, we want Sharia. But then they'll shy away from jizya, of course, tribute on, let's say, Copts or non-Muslims in Egypt. And I don't understand. I mean, who are they kidding with that? So I'd like to hear your insight. If I'm a Muslim and I want pure Islamic law, and the jizya, this isn't just hadith, this is Quran, this is the word of Allah, 929, Quran 929. Fight them and subdue them until they pay jizya and live in submission. So if you have a Salafi, and you see this a lot, this is funny, they're just screaming for Sharia, but then when it comes and someone puts them on the spot about jizya, they're like, no, I don't think we need that. So
Well,
I'd like to hear what you think of that.
I tell you, Raymond, I think that is, in a certain sense, window dressing for Western consumption. They know that to tax people on a religious basis is something that nobody is going to look favorably upon in the Western media, and they're very conscious of their image there. But there have been Salafist and Muslim Brotherhood leaders who have said that they're going to collect the jizya from the Copts, and a Coptic leader was asked about that, and he said, we will resist that to the point of martyrdom. We will resist that to the point of martyrdom. And so when you have the Copts speaking that way, then, the Muslim Brotherhood, obviously, they're not stupid. And they know that if they press this point now, that not only are they going to get condemnations from the international media, which could harm their standing, maybe harm their foreign aid that they receive from Barack Obama. Well, probably nothing would stop that. But maybe stop other sources of aid. And at the same time also lead to bloody uprisings from the Copts all over Egypt, then this is something that they're going to put on the back burner. But I don't think that their declarations that they're not interested in it are to be taken at face value. It's a phenomenon that I've seen many times when I see Islamic supremacist advocates speaking. As a matter of fact, on this very show, on the ABN Jihad Watch show, a few months ago, I debated Anjem Chowdhury, the jihadist leader in Britain. And we were talking about whether Sharia was a good model for society. And he started talking about how in the whole history of the Islamic world, he made this fantastic statement, said in the whole history of the Islamic world, there have only been, I believe it was 52 people stoned to death for adultery, or some ridiculously low number that was obviously false. But the point that he was trying to make was, see, it's not really all that bad. We don't really do this very often. And I thought, well, that's really remarkable. He's supposed to believe that this is the law of God, and yet here he is trying to show that they don't really follow it, that they don't really carry it out all that often. And I thought, well, he's indicating that he doesn't even believe in his own stuff, or at least that he's aware enough of how horrible this looks to non-Muslims, that he knows that he has to try to mitigate it, that he has to try to make it seem as if it's not as bad as it really is. And I think that's what's behind these declarations that you're hearing from Egypt. In any case, the Copts are in a very bad position, as you yourself have noted. And I was wondering if you could also expand on why it is that this transformation has happened. I mean, what kind of appeal was made to those secular Muslims that your parents grew up among? What were they told? What was said to them to make them think, or to make their children think, that they really should be much more hateful toward the Christians than they had been, and they really needed to wear a kaftan and a hijab instead of wearing secular Western dress, and so on. How was this done?
Sure, that's a great question. I'll share with you my own theory, and I kind of intimated to it earlier, which is basically that in the earlier era, when things were nice, for Christians and Muslims were secular, and they didn't even look like Muslims; they looked like Westerners. It was, as I pointed out, Islam from the beginning is about power and glory. Muslims become Muslims not because they want to be martyred and preach peace. They become Muslims and go with Muhammad on the warpath, jihad, and they plunder and they get slaves and they become rich, and that's considered great. And then when they die, they go to heaven and they have an orgy with 72 virgins or raisins or however it's interpreted. But so that kind of mentality, when it was defeated by a very triumphant West, it was kind of a soul-searching moment. It was, I thought we were the good ones. I thought God was on our side. I thought we were right. And then all of a sudden, the West was powerful, and the West was proud of itself, and the West was not apologetic. And the West was basically saying, yeah, you're following a false prophet, and, you people need to at least try to, keep your religion, but, you need to, this is how things are. You need to separate, religion from politics, et cetera, et cetera. And that sort of kind of became dominant because, Muslims looked, hey, that's stronger than us, they're wealthier than us, they're in power of us, they must be onto something. Now, my theory is that, usually we start with the Islamic, revival or revolution or whatever. It's usually pointed to around, the Iranian Revolution in '79. But of course, it goes before that. You have Sayyid Qutb, Muslim Brotherhood, and all these guys have always been around. But so let's say around the 60s and 70s. Now, my belief is that in as much as the West kind of started sloughing off this sort of proud, domineering face that, we have the truth, we're right, this is the way it is, you should become like us. And that's exactly in the 60s and 70s, of course, is when the liberalism set in. And that's when the West became apologetic. That's when the West and academia was all about condemning itself. That's when it was all about praising other cultures, especially Islam. I think that all of that influenced the Islamic world. For starters, the move to extreme liberalism that started happening in the 70s or late 60s was, I think, very distasteful to Muslims. That was kind of a crossing the line. This is too much. These people are really lost. And then on top of that, Westerners became apologetic, and they even said, we're not that, look at us, et cetera, and you're much better than us. So all of that, I think, helped the revival of this mentality, which is, what? We need to go back to the Salaf. We need to go back to our original roots, which is Islam. And so in a way, it's, and most people, especially Muslims, won't like that, but it's a reaction to the West. Whereas the earlier reaction was, one can say, positive, because the West was, in force, and the West was strong and proud of its ways. That influenced Muslims to copy it. Now when the West became weak, at least internally or spiritually, and uncertain and apologetic and ultra-liberal, that it espouses lots of things that on a moral level would be seen very contemptuous to people from the Middle East, not just Muslims, and people outside the West. And as much as the West is doing that, I think it's pushing people, for instance, the Muslims, back to their roots. So I think that's how it started. And of course, you were asking about the Copts in particular, how the hatred came from them. All of this is interrelated, because once a Muslim goes back to the doctrines, and once now they start reading about Islam and and trying to learn what Sharia law is about, they find out that Christians and Jews and all non-Muslims are contemptuous people. At best, you just tolerate them, push them to the side against the wall, like Muhammad recommended, no more churches to be built. And so it's all interrelated. That just comes with the Islamic character, just like all the kaftan and the beard. All of these are just a byproduct of going back to the Islamic identity.
So now turning to the United States, Raymond, the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, is an international organization. Isn't that correct?
Sure, yeah.
And so are they active here? And if so, in what ways?
They're active, this is how I identify visually Muslim Brotherhood characters. They have short beards, very trimmed, and they look clean, and they wear suits. The guys that look like that are often Muslim Brotherhood, or either members or affiliates or sympathizers or people who are on the same page.
That sounds like me.
Well, no.
But seriously, you have described, in a nutshell, the general appearance of people like Jihad Watch and Ibrahim Hooper of the Hamas-linked Council on American Islamic Relations, and other Muslim leaders in the United States like Salam al-Mariyati of the Muslim Public Affairs Council, and quite a few, Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf, the famous Ground Zero Mosque Imam. They all have this kind of look in common.
Which is kind of in between. I'm not a Salafi with a long beard and a jalabiya. I have a suit. I'm kind of moderate, but I have a little thin beard. It's kind of my little token Islamic look. And so yeah, all these guys are in the West. CARE, the ISNA, and all these organizations are just a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And they're of course, and they're doing the same thing that they did in Egypt, which is dawah, but they do it in a different way. Whereas in Egypt and elsewhere, they just, they disseminate Islamic ideas on the grassroots level. Here, it's the dawah of peace. Islam is peace. Islam is moderation. Islam, all these wonderful things. And of course, Westerners want to hear that because they don't want to hear that they're at a perpetual existential war with Islam. And so that's a very comforting message. And look, he's in a suit and he's saying nice things and he's disavowing violence. Hey, why not go? We better join board with this guy other than the Salafi guy with the long beard, because that's the really bad guy. But as we pointed out, they same agenda, just different strategies. And basically the Muslim Brotherhood strategy is much more effective.
So they have the same agenda in the United States as in Egypt.
Sure. I mean, you're familiar with the documents about the, sabotaging the house of war on the inside, and kind of, they're very open about it, what they want to do, and they're doing it. It's just they put on a smiling face. I once even, I saw a video of an Islamic cleric who said, it is impermissible to smile in the face of an infidel, according to Sharia law. But it's okay if you're doing dawah, because when you're doing dawah, you want people to see how nice you are and how happy you are. And I mean, these little things. And then, of course, you look at Muslim Brotherhood members and they all have a nice big smile and they're reaching out to you. But to me, it's just so clear cut. If you're a member of these societies, we know what you want. It's in your charter. It's in your slogan. Mohammed Morsi is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, a leader, the Egyptian president. And we know what their slogan is. As we pointed out, the Quran is our constitution, the following the Prophet, and death and jihad. None of this is ambiguous. So if you're a member of this organization, but you come up and talk about moderation and equality for people and this and that, well, I thought you said the Quran's your constitution. The Quran doesn't talk about equality for people. The discrepancies are so obvious, and that really was my point about when we were talking about the jizya issue. I agree with you completely that there are Salafis they want to, and I believe most of them, anyone who wants Sharia is going to want it because it's part of it. It's just what amazes me is the hypocrisy that is just so obvious and so evident. It's basically, we want Sharia, we want anything and everything as long as it doesn't appear intolerant to the West. But that's not how it works. Sharia law is Sharia law. It's not about what's not intolerant in the eyes of the West. So it's so obvious the kind of game they're playing. But unfortunately, on the West side, we're dealing with very naive people, indifferent people, apathetic people, and of course enablers with this kind of mentality. And so it's become so mainstream, and very few people except us are talking about it even.
Yeah, you're quite right, Raymond. And that leads me to the next question, actually. How is it that they have been so successful in getting politicians on their side, the media on their side, and marginalizing the people who are speaking out against Muslim Brotherhood influence? Are they buying people off, or what kind of appeal do you think they're making the Muslim Brotherhood entities in the United States, like CARE and so on, to the media? Just today I saw there was a raid on a halal meatpacking plant, and the CARE organization put out a press release demanding that there be full disclosure of everything that the government has on this meatpacking plant. And this was reported as news. Civil rights watchdog calls for full disclosure of a raid on halal meatpacking plant. And I thought, Civil Rights Watchdog, this is a group that was designated as an unindicted co-conspirator in a Hamas terror funding case, has numerous links to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, and yet routinely they are characterized in the way they characterize themselves in the mainstream media as a neutral civil rights group with no mention of their Hamas or Muslim Brotherhood links. Now, how is it, why is this happening? How do you think they were able to pull this off and to be so successful in disseminating their propaganda about themselves and about Sharia and the Muslim Brotherhood and about Islam in general?
They did something that we, and by we I mean the West in general, did not do. They did something very smart. They studied and they co-opted the Western mentality and the Western language and the Western paradigms of right and wrong, okay? And you and I have, because we study what they say and we study their texts. So we've done the same thing. But by and large, the Western, especially the mainstream media, the elites, the academics, they live in this world where all they know is their own paradigm, this very liberal, secular paradigm, and they project it on other people. So of course, the Muslim Brotherhood, not only does it have the advantage of it's already being projected on it, this sort of liberal, secular paradigm, but they use the language that comports with it, and so it only validates the Western belief that, hey, these guys are moderate, this and that. And then, so you're asking about, well, what about all the very Islamic references that are involved? And I think there's in the West this, great trepidation to ever talk about religion, especially a foreign religion. I mean, you can attack Christianity and Judaism, but to talk about Islam, this exotic other religion, is immediately you're a racist, even though, as you know, it has nothing to do with race and all this. So they very much mastered the sort of liberal secular paradigm that predominates in the West. And they know how to use it, and they know how to use the words so that to your average Joe Blow who doesn't know anything about Islam, he listens to them and everything they say makes sense, and to even doubt them is to start feeling like you're a racist and you're a bigot, and that's how they're very smart. They've used that. So we are doing the same thing in that we study, what they're doing. In the Islamic world, we study their core texts and their epistemology, but unfortunately in the West, they're not doing that. They're just taking them at their word, and the Islamic Brotherhood are just, giving them the words they want to hear.
Yeah, I think they very cannily played upon the West's great traumas, and the United States, of course, the biggest blot on the history of the United States is racism, and the biggest pride of the United States is the civil rights movement and overcoming racism and granting full equality to racial minorities. But the Muslim Brotherhood groups in the U.S. have been very canny in co-opting and adopting this language, even though, as you quite rightly point out, of course, Islam is not a race, and to oppose jihad and to oppose the spread of Sharia in the West has nothing to do with racism. It has to do with defending equality of rights for all people and the freedom of speech and the freedom of conscience and other aspects of our freedoms that are denied by Sharia. But as far as the Muslim Brotherhood groups like CARE go, they cry racism, and then the mainstream media falls into line, and all too many government and law enforcement officials as well. So where do we go from here, Raymond? What do you think the future holds, and what can free people do to try to preserve our freedoms at this point?
To me, the more I study the situation and the more I study Islam, the more I start seeing the Islamic problem as a symptom of a greater problem, which is what we were just talking about, this sort of Western mentality that is just incapable of transcending its own epistemology, its own knowledge of what reality is, and just it makes things fit into its own categories and its own paradigms, and it just can't take things at face value, can't accept reality. I think that's the problem. I mean, and this is why if you go back earlier generations, the West had a little child in a European country would have understood Islam. No problem. Let's say 100 years ago, or a few hundred years ago at least, 200 years ago, let's say. It was just common sense. They have a religion that, took over a huge chunk of the old world through violence, through force. You can't go there without a permit from the caliph as a foreigner, without being molested and killed. I mean, these things were known, and that's why the so-called Orientalists said these things. But then, of course, Edward Said and the liberal mentality that I was talking about that started in the 70s immediately typecast all that as just Orientalism and bigotry, when in fact it was grounded in reality. And then so the real problem I think that needs to be addressed is this sort of intellectual undermining that just predominates in the West right now. And once that's fixed, I believe the Islamic problem will be fixed, in as far at least as Westerners will understand what they're dealing with and what's at hand. But we're at the point now where, Boko Haram in Nigeria, we're talking about, constantly bombing churches, telling the president leave Christianity, become a Muslim. I mean, kidnapping and raping people caught because they're infidel Christians. And then Barack Obama and the White House won't even classify them as a terrorist organization.
Yeah, it's a shameful thing. Raymond, I'm afraid we're out of time. It's been a fascinating discussion. I wish we had another hour, but I much appreciate you joining us today on ABN's Jihad Watch program. And I'm Robert Spencer. Tune in next week, and we will have more on various aspects of jihad, Islam, and the most pressing issues that face the world today. Thanks for watching.